Yes, medicine was always on the cards. My great uncle was the GP for the Isles of Scilly in the early and mid part of last century, and that's probably the sort of apex of being a proper doctor, someone that could really do everything from an appendectomy to deliver babies without recourse to hospitals on the mainland. So that was always hugely inspiring. He was also quite a character. He owned a hotel and drove a Porsche, so he was very much someone to emulate, and that's I suppose one of the reasons I went into medicine. And yes, I am a cardiologist, and as part of what we'll talk about in a minute, the creation of the Barts Heart Centre was really what got me into an interest in management, and ended up running the hospital. And so everything that happens in St Bartholomew's is now officially my fault, which is, I guess, the role of any CEO. Yeah, well, maybe if I just start with the sort of history of the hospital. We are approaching our 900th anniversary, and that is really a remarkable thing to be able to say. There's very few human endeavours that last 900 years, and to be operating on the same site for that amount of time is quite astonishing. And I think two of the threads that go through the history of Barts are firstly compassion and then excellence, and both of those motivate us to this day. So if you think back to 1123, that was an era unimaginably unlike our own. The whole of society was so very different. The majority of citizens of England were not citizens but serfs. And at that time, this hospital was set up to provide free healthcare. So it was an NHS type system set back all those years ago. This was set up by a chap called Rahir, who was either a courtier or a court jester, depending on who you ask and what it all means back then. He had some sort of religious conversion around 1120, possibly associated with the White Ship loss, in which Henry I's son drowned, and went on a pilgrimage to Rome. Whilst in Rome, he fell desperately ill and prayed that he might recover. And he had a vision of St Bartholomew, one of the apostles, possibly connected with the hospital and monastery in the middle of the Tiber in Rome, in which Bartholomew told him to build a hospital. And Rahir recalls the words, which I'll read to you. Wherefore do thou boldly, at the cost of the building, doubt thee not, direct build and end this work. So very much a no-nonsense apostle, I think. He was clearly, that sense of urgency rings out over the centuries. There are sick people, get on, build this, it's needed. And those are good mottos for our restoration project as well. So as you've indicated, initially this was a religious foundation. And the picture, the stained glass, is really important, because obviously Henry VIII dissolved the monasteries, and the hospital was left without endowment and without income. And after a few fairly wobbly years, eventually Henry VIII, in the last year of his life, granted back with great graciousness all the stuff that he'd nicked off the hospital, and granted the hospital its endowments back. And he's here handing the Charter of Foundation to Thomas Vicary, who was the first master of the barber surgeons, and a very important figure in the history of surgery. So only really the royal family at that time could get away with being thanked profusely for giving back something that they had just taken away. And that really marked the transition from a religious foundation to that governed, as Toby said in his introduction, by the City of London, and the Lord Mayor of London was the president of the Board of Governors all the way up until about 1867. So the city and Barts have been intimately acquainted ever since. You'll see top right there that the sort of jumble of medieval quadrangles that constituted the hospital up until a very important man in our history called James Gibbs, who is a very famous architect who also built St Martin's in the Field and the Radcliffe Camera. And he was commissioned, he was a governor of the hospital, and he was commissioned to transform that medieval warren into a proper Renaissance hospital, and that happened in 1730 when the Great Hall was built. And you can see from bottom right there that the square that still exists at the heart of St Bartholomew's was built of four separate buildings. And that's of interest because that was actually designed to reduce contagion. And during the last year, we have been in a constant scrabble to make sure that all our patients are safe from cross-infection with COVID, and indeed we have been segregating areas within the hospital. So that was very much very appropriate design for the time and has resonance today. But the Great Hall and the North Wing was the administrative block of the hospital, and that was designed, frankly, to impress donors. And they, which I'll come to in a minute, this is the Hogarth Stair, as it is today, and as it was in the 1920s, with some nurses gazing up in wonder at these fantastic paintings. So this was designed to impress. This is the Great Hall itself, and this is the focus of our restoration project. All these tablets on the walls list the donors from, the mid 1500s right up until the beginning of the last century, and the amounts down to pounds, shilling, and pence that they donated. So it is a fantastic space. And I think what's really important is this commitment to excellence. The ambition of this building is quite astonishing, and that, I think, inspires us to this day. In terms of those wonderful paintings, these were painted by Hogarth just after he finished the Rake's Progress. He was commissioned by the hospital to paint these two great paintings, the Good Samaritan and the Pool of Bethesda. You can see the Jesus at the Pool of Bethesda with the crippled man in the distance there. And those, all the models for those paintings were rumoured to be patients of St Bartholomew's at the time, and they display a whole series of pretty unpleasant diseases. There's a whole moral story about righteous illness and the wages of sin as well. So they are a fascinating expression of the ambition of the governors of Bartholomew's Hospital at that time, and that is a huge focus for us. It's almost it is almost unique that a hospital would have such a huge and ambitious space. These photos here showed it being used in the general strike of 1926 with all the mattresses as a sort of barracks, and below it is a picture which just shows how strange medicine, what strange routes medicine takes. That's a picture of children with bony tuberculosis having carbon arc treatment in the 1920s. Quite a sort of scary image. So this sort of brings us on to some of the great alumni of St Bartholomew's. So we have William Harvey. As you all know, the discoverer of the circulation of blood is probably our most eminent alumnus. He was chief physician to the hospital, and lectured on the circulation of blood in St Bartholomew's in 1619. The story goes in the old Great Hall, before that magnificent building you've just seen, that as chief physician he sat on a throne in the Great Hall, and his surgeons brought him in the patients to see. A model I've been trying to run with my surgical colleagues, but they seem reluctant to do that. But these great men and women of our history continue to inspire us. Perhaps one of our worst hours was the Great Plague, when most of the hospital physicians abandoned the hospital and its patients and fled to the countryside. But we still know the name of the matron, Mary Blagg, who stayed behind and provided the care that the physicians had so shamefully abrogated by fleeing. So we have this huge cast list of patients, staff, and distinguished alumni that continue to inspire us. The absolutely vital thing is the recruitment and retention of the best possible people across all the specialties that we have. I think buildings are all very well, and our buildings are magnificent, old and new, but it is people and that spirit of compassion and excellence that drives improvement and drives good patient care. We had a very bumpy patch in the 1990s. There was a review called the Tomlinson Report in 1992, which recommended closure of St Bartholomew's. And 1 million people signed a petition for it to be saved. And it was the incoming Labour government of Tony Blair's first administration, the first health minister, Frank Dobson, who eventually gave us a reprieve. Simon Stevens, the current head of the NHS, came to visit us a few months ago, and he said he was a junior attached to Frank Dobson at the time, and Frank memorably said that he did not want a blue plaque attached to the hospital which said, "Founded by Rahir 1123, closed by Frank Dobson 1998." He said, if the archers of Agincourt were treated there, I'm damned if I'm going to close it. Only he didn't say damned, it was slightly more Anglo-Saxon than that. So we owe Frank a huge debt, and he was a great friend to Barts. Once that had happened, once the hospital was saved, it was then decided that it should be a centre of excellence for cancer and cardiac care. And we were set up as part initially of Barts and the London Trust with our colleagues at the Royal London Hospital, and then Barts Health NHS Trust, which encompasses 4 hospitals across the east of London. And a massive programme of rebuilding started in 2007, with the Cancer Centre opening in 2010 and the Heart Centre in 2015. So as I said at the start, what sort of got me into management was this opportunity that we had to create the Heart Centre, and we did that by merging three hospitals, the London Chest Hospital, the Heart Hospital, and St Bartholomew's, into one big unit. And why did we do that? Well, often mergers are unsuccessful and unpleasant, but ours thankfully has not been. And I think there were 2 imperatives. Firstly, that patients in the East End of London have terrible mortality from heart disease, and that drives, along with deprivation and other diseases such as cancer, that drives a really staggering lowering in mortality in the east of London. So it's calculated that going from Mayfair to the east of London, each tube stop that you go down, you lose a year of life expectancy. So that was a big imperative. And then as modern medicine has got more and more complex, it's quite clear that to get the best possible outcomes, you need to have very specialist teams, and you need a hospital that's big enough to be able to keep those specialist teams at a viable size, and also to keep them at a viable size 24/7, so that you can, if you have a problem with your heart, you're not just seeing any surgeon, you're seeing a surgeon that is specialized and capable of delivering the best possible results. So these are all pictures from the hospital, from our catheter laboratories and theatres. We do now we did before COVID, around 80 cardiac operations a week, well over 200 cardiac procedures a week, and a huge amount of imaging, which is incredibly important in the diagnosis and management of heart disease, both with ultrasound and CT and magnetic resonance scans. So a big endeavour which has been very successful in reducing the mortality from the most serious kinds of heart problems that you get. And this is the other side, the other really important part of Barts is the cancer centre, the second biggest cancer centre in London, with some really top-notch equipment. These are radiotherapy machines. This is our Cyberknife, which is a robot. You might recognize it vaguely from the Fiat adverts a few years ago, because they were actually designed for car manufacture. And they are so accurate that they can deliver radiotherapy beams to precisely the right part of the body, so particularly useful in brain and head cancers. And the next slide also shows our very latest radiotherapy machine, which again is really helpful in getting the best possible outcomes for our cancer patients. It was a terrible, very scary time. We had colleagues in northern Italy, in particular, who were being very rapidly overwhelmed in northern, as I'm sure you'll all remember. And there was just this sense of within the hospital of us trying to get a small ship ready and lashed down before a storm, and we just had no idea what that storm was going to be like. And it is absolutely amazing how much we have learnt in the past year. So around about this time last year, we were faced with, over the course of just a few days, with really unimaginable projections of what could be happening. So you can see this is from, sorry, it doesn't come out very well, but it's from the 24th of March, and this was from the Health Service Journal, which was London's critical care units are 4 days from full capacity without urgent action. And if you, the next slide is not very good quality because it was photographed, but this was probably the key slide that led to the development of the Nightingale Hospital. And this was actually from a couple of days before, from the 22nd of March 2020. And the background here is that there are about 800 baseline intensive care unit beds in London. There are now more, but that was the case a year ago. And you can see that on the 22nd of March, the modelling, as it says in that top box, the modelling now indicates demand for 7,488 ventilated beds by the 3rd of April. So nearly 10 times what we had. And whereas we had been looking at various solutions to increase intensive cares within the hospital environment, which is obviously the best place to put it, you could see that even throwing everything to try and open up intensive care beds in London's hospitals, that extra capacity would be breached on the 1st of April, so with really just a sort of a week from when this slide was taken. And that vast number of patients was what made NHS London choose the Excel Centre, because it was really the only building big enough in London to cope with that volume of patients. So around that weekend, that plan was hatched. that plan was presented to Simon Stevens and approved, and the next morning it was presented to the Prime Minister and approved, so literally in hours. And that just seems incredible to those of us that work in the NHS under normal times, that these things could happen so quickly. And that was really one of the logistical triumphs of the pandemic. So this, many of you may have been to Excel, but this is approximately a fifth of one of the halls in Excel, and as you can see, it's almost impossible to see down the far end. And this is a day or two after the last slide when I first arrived at Excel, and this was being set up. And we had amazing support from the Army. The halls were swarming with Gurkhas, laying copper pipe, getting it ready for us. And this was the Army taking us through a logistical exercise about how we were going to get patients in and out of the unit. Amazing planning and amazing cooperation across the NHS, the Army, and the private sector. So as it turned out, we got a number of things wrong, and thankfully wrong. So that 7,488 turned into about 1,500 patients. Again, nearly double the intensive care unit beds that we had, but much, much more manageable. And we only took 54 patients into the Nightingale. And I'm immensely proud that when we look back after a year, that their results were just as good as the UK average for intensive care patients. Despite it being a completely new team in a completely new environment, an ITU in a conference centre is just an extraordinary concept, that those patients had equal outcomes to the UK average. I think looking back, the other thing that we got wrong was the whole concept of COVID intensive care, because a lot of our thinking, quite rightly, was based on the influenza pandemics. And patients with influenza who need intensive care usually only have their lungs messed up, and all their other organs are working fine. So despite being in intensive care, they're relatively simple intensive care patients that really just need a ventilator. And hence the Nightingale model was designed for that sort of environment. Actually, if you end up sadly in intensive care with COVID, you have multiple systems failing. You can have heart problems, kidney problems, and you really do need a full intensive care unit, and that should be within a major hospital. And now I'm pleased to say our reaction in the second wave allowed all the patients that we needed, despite it being twice as big as the first, were treated within the hospital system, which is much more appropriate. And the Nightingale was used much more as a step-down facility, which for somewhere that isn't in a hospital environment is much more appropriate. Yeah, so I think we have learnt so much, as I said. So I think firstly, we had too little intensive care capacity in this country, and I think there's every sign that that lesson has been learnt, and we are now looking to expand intensive care capacity. When one talks about expanding intensive care capacity, we're not talking, well, 5% of that is buildings and equipment. The majority of that is trained staff. So I think we must get ourselves to a position where we have many more trained intensive care unit staff. There is a sort of rather stupid saying that the NHS is surprised by winter every year, and it's true. We always run out of beds at about the same time each year as the normal winter diseases strike. And I hope that this pandemic has taught us that we need reserve capacity within our hospital system. That's how we run our sewers, it's how we run our electricity, with built-in redundant capacity, and we need to run our hospital system with potentially empty beds and potentially reserve workforce to come in and stop there being masses of patients cancelled every winter because there aren't enough beds. And so I think that if we could really achieve that, that would be a huge plus to have come out of COVID. The second wave, as I said, we managed in a different way. We had a different role here at St Bartholomew's. We had commissioned at the Royal London Hospital in Whitechapel 150 bedded intensive care unit space against a background intensive care capacity at the Royal London of around 50 beds. So an absolutely enormous unit, the biggest in the UK. And unfortunately, during the second wave, that was full. So we had over 200 patients with COVID on intensive care. The group, Barts Health, was seeing 90 patients a day at peak. And over the course of the pandemic, Barts Health has treated 13,000 patients with COVID in hospital. So those numbers give you a sense of the scale of the problem that we were dealing with. And it was very worrying time around Christmas because every intensive care bed we opened up, and on some days we'd opened up 10 intensive care unit beds by redeploying staff and who were absolutely heroic and amazing. But still, the next morning they were all full, and we had to open up some more. So that second wave was of a much greater severity than we expected. I think almost everyone thinks it was down to the new variant because the modelling up until really late November was that that wave was not going to be of the magnitude that it turned out to be. Thankfully now we've gone several days without admitting any COVID patients. We're running at about 1 a day, not 90. So it's still out there, but in very low levels, and everything is gradually returning to normal. And the staff that were redeployed, so we deployed half our consultant staff outside St Bartholomew's to support the other hospitals in the group, and over 300 staff in all. They are now nearly all back with us, and we now obviously now have the mountain to climb of all those poor people waiting for all the healthcare that they need in normal times. As you'll have seen from the news today, the nearly 5 million people on the NHS waiting list. So that's our next job. They were very badly affected in both waves, but better in the second. So in the first wave, there was a really big problem with cardiac surgery across London, and St Bartholomew's and Harefield, being two hospitals that didn't have A&Es, were designated as the sort of hubs for all emergency surgery and urgent surgery. And we kept going throughout the first wave in those two hospitals when most of the other cardiac units in London couldn't operate because their intensive care units were completely full of COVID patients. And I'm very proud to say that we did not give any patient at St Bartholomew's COVID by doing their emergency operation, because if you do infect a patient with COVID when they've just had a bypass, it is a really bad situation. So infection control had to be absolutely immaculate, and I'm pleased to say that it was. Which leads me on to the other point, which is of more relevance more widely, in that everything, COVID environment is more difficult. That scanners have to be cleaned much more thoroughly every time a patient has been through a scan. So the amount of scans that you can do in a day is reduced. The amount of beds that we have has been reduced by about 10% because we have to zone patients so that if they've come in as an emergency, we have to treat them as though they have COVID until we've proven that they haven't. So there is a reduction in bed capacity and a reduction in efficiency consequent upon COVID. And then obviously for the vast majority of procedures in both waves, all but the most urgent things were stopped. And if you're living with needing a hip replacement, you are in daily severe pain, and not having that for a year is really a terrible thing. In terms of our cancer centre, again, we've learnt so much. In the first wave, there was a real focus on not having people in hospital. We feared that cancer patients would catch COVID in hospital. And so we did stop a lot of cancer work. In the second wave, we carried on, and really we treated almost normal numbers of patients in terms of outpatients and radiotherapy and chemotherapy in the second wave. So we haven't at least added to the problems in cancer treatment by making people wait longer. We are obviously wanting to celebrate. This is a huge moment for us. We want our staff to be able to celebrate this great anniversary, but we also want to use this as an opportunity to raise the profile of what we do, and to use it as a spur to raise funds. So we want to direct and end this work in St Bartholomew's words. So firstly and most importantly, we've set up this trust called Barts Heritage, run by an incredibly able Will Palin with a huge background in historic buildings. And our first and most important job is to protect those beautiful buildings that we've seen a little bit of this evening. And we have well worked up plans. It is, as you would expect, with a Grade 1 listed building, enormously expensive to do this properly. We're looking at grants from the Heritage Lottery Foundation, but we want to turn this building into something that has really comes alive rather than just being a museum. So we're going to use it for staff health and well-being, for exhibitions, for concerts, really restoring it back to its original purpose of being of use to the hospital. It will obviously have a commercial future as well in terms of being a venue. It is probably one of the biggest halls that you can potentially hire within the City of London, and it's a beautiful space for all those sort of celebrations or meetings. But we don't want to turn it into a giant livery hall. It has to be a living, breathing part of the hospital, and I think the plans that we've come up with really reflect that. So as you'll see in the next slide, restoration work has already begun on these amazing paintings and buildings. And if you go on to the next slide, you can see what really makes me very excited about this project is how by bringing in our staff into these buildings, we've used them to fit test their masks. We've used it, as I say, for health and well-being areas. It's connecting the buildings with the living hospital, which is a really important bit of what we want to achieve through the 900th campaign and through the fundraising that Barts Heritage is embarking on.